The banquet hall shimmered with golden chandeliers, laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Every seat was filled with power, politicians, investors, and the billionaire whose charity gala was meant to save lives. But just as she lifted her champagne to toast her empire's success, a ragged voice pierced through the orchestra. A homeless black boy, barefoot and trembling, burst through the doors and shouted, "Do not drink that!" The room gasped. Security moved. Cameras flashed. But in that one frozen moment, the billionaire's smile faltered, because the boy's eyes held a truth she did not yet understand. Before we uncover the truth behind his desperate warning, make sure you subscribe to Racism Untold Stories, where every story reveals the hidden side of power, prejudice, and redemption that society tries to silence. The night had the kind of stillness that carried a secret. Rain drizzled down the glass towers of the city, tracing veins of silver across the skyline. Every droplet shimmered beneath the streetlights, reflecting both beauty and indifference. The Astoria Grand Hotel stood at the heart of it all, a monument of marble and arrogance. Inside, the world of the powerful gathered beneath chandeliers that looked like captured stars. Outside, the forgotten world pressed against the cold, unseen glass of society's divide. In that world outside stood Noah, small, shivering, and alone. His body was frail. His clothes clung to his damp skin, but his eyes burned with a restless fire that the rain could not extinguish. He had been on the streets since his mother's death 6 months ago, learning the cruel arithmetic of survival. Food was luck. Warmth was mercy. Safety was a myth. Yet even after nights spent beneath bridges and days begging for coins that rarely came, he had never begged for dignity. That he kept. The city had learned to ignore children like Noah. People stepped around him as though poverty were contagious. When they glanced his way, they saw only failure, never the system that had abandoned him. To them, he was a shadow that did not belong in their polished world. Noah's mother, Marilyn, had once believed in the promise of progress. She worked 2 jobs at a laundromat and a diner, saving for a better life. When the charity called Voss Pure opened a campaign to bring clean water to underserved communities, she wept with gratitude. The bottles carried a white dove, a symbol of purity, hope, and trust. She gave one to Noah every morning before school. Then came the coughing, the rash, the fever that did not break. Hospitals asked for money she did not have. Lawyers never returned her calls. When she died, the doctor said it was a reaction to an unverified chemical additive. But the company denied responsibility. They issued statements of sympathy, not accountability. That company belonged to Eleanor Voss, the billionaire humanitarian whose face appeared on every magazine cover. Her brand was built on generosity, her empire on illusion. She had mastered the art of disguising greed as grace. People called her the angel of the underserved. Noah called her the woman who took everything. He remembered the logo on the bottles stacked beside her photo at the memorial service. He remembered how reporters turned away when he tried to speak. And he remembered the silence that followed. A silence that buried truth deeper than any grave. Tonight, that same logo returned like a ghost. Noah had been searching the alleyways behind restaurants, looking for leftover food, when he noticed a truck with that familiar white dove. He froze, his breath catching in the cold air. Men in suits unloaded boxes stamped Voss Pure. He watched them wheel the crates through the service entrance of the hotel. Through the transparent wrapping, he could see the bottles gleaming like polished lies. He followed, careful to stay in the shadows. The hotel's kitchen was a storm of motion, chefs shouting, waiters rushing, steam clouding the air. None of them noticed the boy crouched near the doorway, watching as servers filled trays with champagne flutes and bottles of water bearing the same symbol that had killed his mother. He felt his chest tighten. The world tilted, as though fate had placed him at the crossroads of vengeance and justice. His hands trembled, but his heart hardened. He did not know how, but he knew he had to stop them. Inside the ballroom, everything was gold. Golden lights, golden laughter, golden promises of a better world built on other people's pain. The stage was adorned with a banner. Voss Foundation, Annual Gala, Changing Lives Through Compassion. Every word was a lie. Noah pressed his face against the glass doors, watching the woman who had shaped his suffering. Eleanor Voss stood on the stage, radiant in a silver gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. Her beauty was the kind that demanded attention, her confidence the kind that had never been questioned. Cameras adored her, investors worshipped her, and the crowd clapped as she smiled with practiced warmth. Noah's stomach twisted. He thought of his mother's smile, her cracked lips whispering that she trusted that woman's water to keep them alive. Now the same brand sparkled on tables set for the rich, waiting to be toasted in celebration of false virtue. A waiter uncorked a bottle nearby. Noah flinched at the sound. Every hiss of air escaping the seal reminded him of the oxygen that had left his mother's lungs. The scent of expensive perfume drifted through the lobby, blending with the faint bitterness of alcohol. He could hear the crowd inside chanting her name. To Eleanor, to compassion, to clean water for all. He bit his lip until it bled. Compassion had never reached the slums. Clean water had never reached the shelter where his mother had taken her last breath. Through the shimmering glass, Noah saw a small group of children brought on stage to represent beneficiaries. They wore clean clothes, their smiles rehearsed, their innocence borrowed for publicity. He knew some of those children lived only blocks from where he used to. Their families would never see a penny of the millions raised tonight. He felt something awaken inside him, something that had been quiet for too long. It was not anger alone. It was truth demanding to be heard. Noah looked at the bottles again. The batch number on the label was familiar. He had seen it on the report he once stole from a clinic's trash, the same batch that was recalled quietly, never publicly admitted to be contaminated. They were serving poison to the very people celebrating purity. The thought struck like lightning. His breath quickened. His pulse thundered in his ears. He had no proof that this batch was still tainted, but he could not take that chance. He tried to shout through the glass, but his voice vanished against the thick silence of privilege. The guards at the door ignored him, more concerned with turning away the poor than preventing a disaster. Inside, the music softened. Eleanor stepped to the podium, her smile glowing under the spotlight. She thanked her guests for their continued trust and generosity. Her words floated through the speakers like honey covering rot. Noah pressed his hands against the glass. His reflection looked ghostly, a boy caught between two worlds, the living and the forgotten. He knew he had to act. Not tomorrow, not later, now. He slipped through the side entrance, unnoticed as waiters hurried past. His wet shoes squeaked on the marble floor, but the orchestra masked the sound. He climbed the carpeted steps toward the grand hall, his heart racing with every beat. Behind the curtain, he could see Eleanor lifting her glass. The crowd rose in anticipation of her toast. Every camera pointed at her, every eye filled with admiration. And then, as the first word left her lips, Noah stepped forward, his small figure illuminated by the golden light of hypocrisy. He drew a deep breath, the kind that carried all his grief, all his fear, all his hope, and screamed from the bottom of his soul, "Do not drink that!" The orchestra stopped. The guests froze. The billionaire's hand halted midair. And in that single heartbeat, the world Noah knew, the world that silenced the poor, finally heard him. The ballroom descended into silence so thick that even the air seemed afraid to move. Every glittering crystal, every polished silver spoon, every diamond-encrusted watch appeared to pause in disbelief. For a moment, the world hung between two breaths, one of luxury and one of truth. Noah's voice still echoed through the hall. His small frame stood out among gowns and tuxedos, rain-soaked and trembling beneath the golden chandeliers. Water dripped from his hair onto the marble floor, forming tiny puddles that reflected a reality no one wanted to see. Eleanor Voss lowered her glass slowly. Her public smile remained frozen, though her eyes flickered, not with fear, but with the irritation of someone whose perfect illusion had been interrupted. The cameras pointed toward her, waiting to see how she would respond. In her world, reputation was survival, and weakness was a disease. Security guards rushed forward, their black suits swallowing the boy's fragile figure. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Guests whispered in disgust, not at the possibility of danger, but at the audacity of a child to step inside their world. The strings of the orchestra hesitated, then fell silent completely. Noah struggled against the men holding his arms, his voice cracking through the heavy air. He shouted words that no one wanted to hear, his accusations scattered like sparks across the marble, unwanted and misunderstood. The billionaire raised her hand, commanding silence. Her tone was gentle but sharp, polished by years of public speaking. She told the audience that the boy was confused, that he meant no harm. She promised everything was under control. Her smile returned, soft, maternal, false. But something inside her was no longer steady. From the corner of the room, a woman stood quietly. She was a journalist for a small independent outlet, invited only because her editor wanted human interest photos of the event. Her name was Tessa Lang. Unlike the others, she had not been distracted by the glamour. She had noticed the tremor in Eleanor's hand, the way her assistants whispered behind the curtain, the faint tremble in the boy's voice when he screamed. When the guards began dragging Noah away, Tessa saw something fall from his jacket pocket, a small, torn piece of paper, soaked but legible enough to reveal the white Dove logo and a series of printed numbers. A batch code. Her instincts sharpened. She picked it up discreetly and slipped it into her purse. Meanwhile, the guards forced Noah toward the exit. He screamed again, his voice raw with desperation. "My mother died because of that water!" he shouted. "You are killing them again!" The crowd recoiled as if his pain were contagious. Some laughed uncomfortably. Others looked away, pretending they had not heard. Eleanor turned to her guests and spoke of mental illness and unfortunate circumstances, crafting sympathy into manipulation. Her guests nodded obediently, eager to return to the comfort of ignorance. The orchestra began to play again, soft at first, as if attempting to erase the disruption. Waiters resumed their duties. The facade of elegance returned, fragile, trembling, and false. Yet beneath the music, the truth was beginning to breathe. Outside the ballroom doors, Noah fell to his knees on the marble steps. His hands shook as he pressed them against the floor, rainwater mingling with tears. His body ached, but his spirit refused to break. He could hear faint laughter from inside, the sound of people toasting lies. Then the sirens began, not of police, but of phones. Notifications buzzed throughout the ballroom. Guests looked at their screens, confusion spreading like wildfire. Tessa Lang had published her article, a breaking news story with the headline, "Charity Water Scandal. New evidence links Voss Pure to fatal contamination in low-income communities." Attached was a photo of the batch code she found, matched with leaked documents from a prior lawsuit that the company had buried under settlements and silence. One by one, the guests' smiles faltered. Murmurs spread. The orchestra stopped again, their instruments hanging mid-air. Eleanor's assistant rushed to her side, whispering frantically. The billionaire's perfectly rehearsed calm cracked under the weight of something she could not control: the truth. For the first time in years, Eleanor Voss felt small. The name she had built into a fortress was trembling like a candle in the wind. The journalists in the crowd lifted their cameras. Reporters from larger networks began calling their editors. What had begun as a glamorous evening of charity transformed into a stage for exposure. Outside, Noah lifted his head, unaware that his truth was finally being heard beyond those golden doors. His body was weak, his throat raw, but his mother's voice echoed in his mind. Do not stop speaking when silence is injustice. Inside, chaos replaced applause. Guests whispered accusations. Investors pulled out their phones to contact lawyers, and the stage lights felt hotter than ever before. Eleanor's publicist begged her to make a statement, but her mind was spiraling through memories she had buried. She remembered the reports that crossed her desk 2 years earlier. The warnings from engineers, the letters from local doctors, the photographs of children with rashes and burns. She remembered dismissing them, convincing herself it was not her responsibility. She had told her team to manage the narrative, to make sure the company stayed untouched. Now, she was the one who felt contaminated. Tessa's story spread faster than wildfire. Within minutes, it appeared on major news sites. Social media ignited with outrage. Hashtags carrying the names of the victims began trending. Screens across the room glowed with judgment. Eleanor's eyes darted to the stage, where the bottles of Vospure still stood, glittering symbols of her empire. They gleamed like trophies of deception. She felt the weight of every child who had fallen sick, every family that had lost someone, every voice she had silenced, and among them the voice of one boy, now echoing louder than ever. Security officers informed her that Noah was still outside, surrounded by reporters who wanted to hear his story. She hesitated. The instinct of self-preservation whispered to retreat, to let lawyers and public relations teams handle the damage. But another voice spoke within her, quieter, unfamiliar, and heavy with shame. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the glass walls as if the world itself demanded cleansing. Eleanor walked away from the stage. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step sounding less confident than the last. Cameras followed her, recording what they thought would be a statement. But she did not stop to speak. When she reached the doors, she saw him, the boy standing in the rain, shaking but unbroken. The crowd outside parted, a wall of umbrellas and flashing lights framing the confrontation between privilege and pain. Their eyes met. For the first time, Eleanor Voss saw not a nuisance, not a problem to erase, but the face of truth. The boy's gaze held no hatred, only exhaustion and the weight of generations who had been silenced before him. Behind her, her guests watched, unsure whether to pity her or fear her. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every tremor of her lips, every flicker of emotion. The billionaire's world, built on lies and applause, had collided with the raw, unvarnished reality of injustice. And in that collision, something irreversible had begun. The boy who was meant to disappear had become the voice of a movement. The woman who built her empire on deceit was standing in the ruins of her own creation. The music of the night had died. Only truth remained. The night air outside the Astoria Grand was electric with noise and consequence. Reporters crowded the steps, their microphones raised like weapons of truth. Cameras flashed endlessly, painting the scene in bursts of white light. The billionaire who once commanded boardrooms and international summits now stood exposed beneath the relentless rain. Eleanor Voss had never known silence like this. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of being watched, dissected by millions, judged by a world that had once adored her. The glittering facade of success that had defined her life was collapsing, piece by piece, beneath the weight of what she had denied. Across from her stood Noah, soaked to the bone, his small frame trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion and vindication. His lips were pale, his eyes unblinking, his body swaying slightly as though the truth itself had drained the last of his strength. Yet he remained standing, a lone shadow before a crumbling empire. Between them, The rain fell harder. Each drop seemed to echo the words that had already spread across every screen and every corner of the internet. The story was out. The evidence was undeniable. The headlines scrolled across live broadcasts. Voss Pure Scandal. Billionaire's charity linked to deaths of marginalized families. Eleanor's publicist tried to push through the crowd, begging her to return inside. Lawyers called her phone endlessly. The board members of her company were sending frantic messages, demanding statements, explanations, damage control. But for the first time in her life, Eleanor did not move toward control. She stood still, facing the very consequence she had spent years avoiding. The boy she had dismissed as a disturbance was now the mirror of her moral decay. The flashing cameras reflected her face, pale, drenched, fragile. Her makeup had begun to melt away, streaking down her cheeks like ink on ruined paper. The perfect image was dissolving, leaving behind a woman who looked painfully human. Noah's voice broke through the thunder. It was quiet, but every microphone caught it. "My mother believed in you." Those 5 words cut through the chaos sharper than any accusation. The crowd fell silent again. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, as if realizing they were witnessing something beyond spectacle, something sacred, something tragic. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Her throat tightened. She remembered the brochures, the commercials, the smiling children holding bottles of her branded water. She remembered the boardroom meetings where her executives assured her that the contamination was minimal, that a few isolated cases would never reach the media. She had nodded, telling herself she was protecting her company, her employees, her investors. But what she had really protected was her image, the illusion that she was the savior of the poor, when in truth she had poisoned them. The boy's words echoed again, heavier this time. "She trusted you. She thought your water was safe. She thought you cared." Eleanor's eyes blurred with tears that mixed with the rain. Her lips trembled. She had stood on stages across the world speaking of compassion and justice, and yet this boy's truth had undone every carefully constructed lie in an instant. Behind her, the crowd of elites watched from the doorway, their expressions a mixture of shock and self-preservation. Some of them had donated millions to her foundation, some had profited from her influence. None dared step forward. The distance between them and the boy was the distance between comfort and conscience. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice trembling but audible. "I did not know," she began, but the words faltered. She knew it was a lie the moment it left her mouth. She had known enough to bury it. She had known enough to silence those who tried to speak. She had known enough to sleep comfortably while others died thirsty. Her voice broke completely. "I wanted to believe it was fixed." The crowd shifted. Rain splattered on microphones. Reporters leaned closer. Noah did not reply. He did not need to. His silence was its own form of truth, the kind that exposed guilt more powerfully than accusation ever could. A journalist shouted a question from the crowd. "Mrs. Voss, do you take responsibility for the deaths linked to your company?" Eleanor's head bowed. She could hear her lawyer's voice in her earpiece through the phone pressed to her assistant's ear, urging her to deny everything, to say it was under investigation. But the words that rose in her chest were different this time, unpolished, unfiltered, real. "Yes," she said softly. Her assistant froze. The crowd gasped. Eleanor lifted her gaze, her voice growing steadier. "Yes. I knew there were problems. I looked away. I wanted to protect my name more than I wanted to protect lives, and because of that, people suffered, people died." Each sentence cracked the image she had built, but she did not stop. The truth came in waves, painful yet cleansing. "I built an empire on the illusion of compassion. I wanted to be seen as a savior, but I became the very thing I claimed to fight. There is no forgiveness for that, not yet. Perhaps not ever." The rain poured harder, washing over her words like baptism. The crowd murmured. Cameras recorded every second, the billionaire stripped bare of power, the boy standing before her like conscience incarnate. Noah's knees gave way and he stumbled. A paramedic from the crowd rushed forward to help him, covering him with a coat. Eleanor instinctively moved closer, reaching out, her hand trembling as she brushed against the boy's sleeve. It was the first time in years that she had touched someone without agenda, without calculation. In that moment, she realized that the world she had built was hollow. Her power had never been real. It had only existed as long as people believed her lies. Now the one person she had never noticed had dismantled it with a single act of truth. The police arrived soon after, not to arrest her yet, but to escort her away from the chaos. As they guided her toward the waiting car, she looked back at Noah one last time. He was sitting beneath the awning, wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by reporters and strangers offering food and warmth. He looked small, but there was something monumental about him, something eternal. Eleanor realized that she was witnessing the transfer of power, not the kind measured in money or fame, but in moral weight. The boy who had nothing now carried everything that mattered. As the car door closed, she heard one last question shouted through the storm. "What will you do now, Mrs. Voss?" She looked out the window at the city she had deceived. For the first time, she saw not glass and glamour, but faces, tired, struggling, human. "I will face it," she whispered. "All of it." Her voice was lost in the roar of thunder, but Noah heard her. And though forgiveness was still far away, the truth had finally been spoken aloud. That night, across every screen in the country, people watched the fall of Eleanor Voss. Some saw justice, some saw tragedy, but those who listened closely heard something deeper. The sound of an empire built on false virtue collapsing under the weight of an honest boy's cry. And above the noise, above the rain, above the ruin of reputation and power, one truth rang clear and unbreakable. Sometimes the loudest voice in the world is the one that refuses to stay silent. The morning after the gala felt like the world had shifted its axis. Newspapers lay on doorsteps across the city, their headlines heavy with revelation. The same image appeared everywhere, Eleanor Voss standing in the rain, her eyes hollow, facing a boy who looked both fragile and immortal. The billionaire's empire, once untouchable, had fallen in a single night. Stock prices of Voss Pure plummeted before sunrise. The company's investors withdrew support, and the board members who once praised Eleanor's leadership now released carefully worded statements distancing themselves from her. News channels replayed her confession over and over, dissecting every syllable. But behind the noise of outrage, something quieter was happening, something human. In a small shelter on the south side of the city, Noah awoke in a clean bed for the first time in months. The blanket around him was warm, smelling faintly of soap and kindness. His body ached from exhaustion, but his heart carried a strange stillness, a calm he had not known since his mother's death. The paramedics who had taken him from the hotel had refused to let him return to the streets. The journalist, Tessa Lang, had stayed with him through the night, answering reporters' questions only when necessary, shielding him from cameras when his eyes filled with tears. She had promised that his story would be told with dignity, not spectacle. When Noah sat up, sunlight poured through the narrow window beside him. It touched the corner of a newspaper someone had left on the chair. His own face was there, small, wet, defiant. Beside the words, "The boy who stopped the toast." He stared at it for a long time. He did not feel like a hero. He did not feel powerful. He felt tired and human and uncertain about what would come next. But beneath that uncertainty was something new. The faint warmth of purpose. Outside the shelter, people had already begun to gather. Some brought flowers for the victims whose names were finally being spoken aloud. Others brought signs demanding justice. For the first time, those neighborhoods, long ignored, long silenced, were being seen. Their grief had a voice now, and that voice began with a boy who refused to stay silent. Meanwhile, Eleanor Voss remained hidden behind the tall gates of her estate. Reporters surrounded her property day and night. Her legal team worked frantically to manage the tidal wave of lawsuits and criminal investigations. Several of her executives had already been arrested for falsifying safety reports. Investigators uncovered internal memos proving deliberate negligence. Inside her house, the rooms felt empty despite their grandeur. The mirrors no longer flattered her reflection, they exposed it. The awards lining her walls, humanitarian plaques, framed magazine covers, and gilded trophies, no longer spoke of success. They whispered of hypocrisy. For days, she refused to turn on the television, but silence has a way of amplifying guilt. Eventually, she could not bear it any longer. She watched the footage of that night on repeat. Her own trembling hands, her own words of confession, the boy's quiet strength. Each replay stripped another layer of denial from her soul. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. The empire that once demanded every minute of her life now demanded her conscience instead. On the 5th day after the scandal, she called her lawyer and made a decision that startled everyone around her. She announced that she would testify publicly, not to protect herself, but to expose every person, every transaction, and every cover-up involved in the contamination scandal. When she took the stand weeks later, the courtroom was overflowing. The same cameras that once adored her now filmed her downfall. Yet, as she spoke, there was a strange sincerity in her tone. For the first time, she was not speaking for applause. She was speaking to make something right. She revealed how profits had been prioritized over safety, how entire shipments of untested chemicals had been approved, and how lawyers had silenced early whistleblowers. She handed over documents that confirmed what victims had always known, that lives had been exchanged for money and reputation. When she finished, the room was silent. Some wept. Some glared. But no one could deny that she had finally faced the truth. Outside the courthouse, crowds of protesters cheered not for Eleanor but for justice. And standing among them, wearing an oversized coat and holding a small sign that read, "Truth Never Dies," was Noah. He watched her exit the building surrounded by reporters. Their eyes met briefly. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude, before disappearing into the storm of cameras. Months passed. The scandal reshaped public policy, corporate ethics, and media awareness. New safety laws were enacted. Independent agencies began monitoring the distribution of aid products in impoverished communities. The government announced a national task force dedicated to investigating corporate negligence in minority neighborhoods. Eleanor Voss served time. Not long compared to the magnitude of her crimes, but long enough to strip her of illusion. After her release, she did not return to luxury. She moved into a small, rented apartment on the city's edge and began volunteering anonymously at shelters, cleaning floors, serving food, and learning what humility felt like. One afternoon, she arrived at a new community center built in one of the neighborhoods once poisoned by her factories. The walls were painted with murals created by local children, vivid colors of hope, defiance, and rebirth. At the center of one mural, a dove broke through its own chains, surrounded by blue ripples that symbolized clean water. Beneath it was a single name written in small, careful letters: Noah. Eleanor stood before it for a long time, the sound of laughter echoing behind her as children ran through the hall. Her chest tightened, not with pride, but with the weight of what redemption costs. She never approached Noah again. She knew forgiveness was not hers to claim, but she began funding projects quietly, without her name attached, rebuilding what greed had destroyed. As for Noah, life moved forward slowly, unevenly. With the help of Tessa and a few honest organizations, he began attending school again. He studied tirelessly, driven not by ambition but by remembrance. He joined youth advocacy groups, speaking about environmental justice and corporate accountability. Every time he stood before an audience, he felt his mother's voice beside him, steady and proud. Years later, he stood on another stage, smaller, humbler, but brighter in meaning. Behind him, a banner read, "The Clean Future Initiative." In front of him sat dozens of children from low-income families, each holding a cup of water from the very wells he had helped install. He looked out at them and smiled. His voice, now deeper and stronger, filled the room. "We cannot change what has been done," he said, "but we can decide what happens next." The crowd rose in applause. Among them, a woman in plain clothes sat quietly, her face half hidden beneath a scarf. Eleanor Voss watched him, her eyes wet, her heart heavy with both grief and gratitude. When Noah finished, she slipped out unnoticed, leaving behind a small envelope addressed only with the words, "For the next generation of truth." Inside was a handwritten note. "Sometimes the ones we ignore are the ones who could save us. E.V." Noah found it later. He read it in silence, folded it gently, and placed it beneath the mural of the dove. The world had changed because one boy refused to look away. The powerful had fallen, the forgotten had risen, and truth had found its voice. Would you have listened to him that night? Or would you have dismissed the voice that tried to save you? If this story touched you, remember, truth has no voice unless we listen. Subscribe to Racism Untold Stories to uncover more powerful tales of injustice, courage, and redemption that the world tries to hide. Every story we tell is not just fiction, it is a mirror held up to society. Will you dare to look into it?